Long-time viewers may have noticed that I love to show old magazine reviews and retro games I cover. I do this really as I feel it's unfair to judge old games by today's standards. So putting them in context of what reviewers thought at the time gives you a better scope of their sentiment. However, every now and then you'll stumble across something a journalist said whose sheer stupidity just beggars belief. So this episode I dedicate to those doltish discourses, those puerile periodicals and those high-scoring reviews of Peter Molyneux games circa 2002 onwards. But hello you, I'm Guru Larry and I welcome you to Fact Hunt. Top 5 stupid things said by games journalists. Well, it should be top 5 stupid things said by games journalists in hindsight, but I'm feeling particularly vindictive today, so I'm leaving that bit out of the title. Our first entry goes to the much-loved British magazine Computer and Video Games. You've probably heard me talk about them many times in previous Fact Hunt and Games Yanks Cunt Wank episodes, but they are the video game print media equivalent of a puppy. They get excited about everything and constantly sniff publishers' butts before running out into the street and getting run over by Future Publishing's transit of incompetence, who thought Games Master was a better magazine. It's not. It's really shit. Now, CVG have said some particularly stupid things over the years, such as telling someone who wrote in that Final Fight would never appear on a Sega console, only to preview Final Fight CD 3 months later. But their ultimate divviness falls on their short-lived biannual series, The Complete Guide to Consoles. In the news segment, they had a report on their trip to CES, the days before gaming hadn't split off to form E3. And they were particularly impressed by a brand new handheld system Sega was showing off at their booth, which they dubbed the microdrive. It had impressive graphics, it had a colour screen when that was a thing to be proud about back then, but also, this handheld device could additionally play games from the recently released 16-bit console, the Sega Mega Drive. Or Sega Genesis if you live in the US. Now you're thinking, they're talking about the Sega Nomad, aren't you? But no! This was 1990. They were actually previewing the Sega Game Gear. Yup, CVG stated you could play Mega Drive games on a Game Gear. Now in all fairness, they did state that the cartridges would be in a different shape, and the Master System adapter didn't even exist back then. But rest in peace, CVG. You may no longer be with us, but your wildly incorrect predictions shall ever remain immortal. The easiest way to peeve off a gamer in this day and age is for a publisher to dictate how and when you could play your own legitimately bought game. And nothing proved this further than the debacle that was EA and their 2013 release of SimCity. For those of you who don't know, EA insisted that SimCity, despite being a single player game, could only be played while connected online. But despite receiving mass complaints about this issue, both EA and SimCity developer Maxis claimed patching the game to make it offline would be an impossible task. So, poised with this monumental piece of truthhood, Polygon's review editor and professional Benny from the Mummy impersonator, Arthur Gies, who had previously re-reviewed the game for Polygon, giving it 8 out of 10, jumped onto Twitter to white knight Electronic Arts on these hordes of ill-informed idiots who claimed otherwise, with the tweet, "If you don't work at Maxis and insist SimCity could be updated to be offline, you literally don't know what you're talking about." This is a pretty famous tweet in itself, but reading into the replies, Arthur goes on to insist that even programmers themselves are ignorant if they didn't work on the game, let alone the public who blatantly knew otherwise. He even goes off to scoff at people showing him evidence it was possible to play offline. Now, the hilarious part of this whole story is less than 5 days after Arthur posted that tweet, someone who obviously didn't work on the game, therefore didn't know what they were talking about, actually did manage to hack it to add an offline mode, with EA themselves releasing an official offline patch 10 months later. So, after this virtual slap in the face, Polygon went full derp and changed their review score from a 9.5 to an 8, then to a 4, and currently to a 6.5, making the whole purpose of reviewing a game pointless if you're going to give it every number available. But was this a ruse from EA to deter piracy, and they simply didn't care if people had ripped it after a year of release? We may never know. Well, other than blindly following EA's press releases and not, actually being a journalist, made Arthur Gies look like a pompous, ignorant twat. The PlayStation Vita was a fantastic little machine in its own right. It may have had bugger all games out for it, but it was incredibly impressive graphically and had an absolutely gorgeous OLED screen, though there was no doubt in anyone's mind it was sadly doomed to failure. However, all someone at IGN wanted for Christmas was a PSV, as Colin Moriarty, a guy who strawmanned so many arguments he should be called the Wicker Man, thought it was destined for commercial victory in his 2011 article, "The PlayStation Vita is set to succeed." Now, Colin's two main focuses on this whole piece is declaring how large a games library the PS Vita will have, by telling us the launch titles, which ironically are the only games anyone can actually remember about the PS Vita, followed up by constantly shitting on the 3DS. For example, he boasts informed proclamations such as, "Vita is destined to sell better." Okay, well, let's have a look at those sales numbers, eh? So, Nintendo, who has dominated every single generation of handheld gaming, is suddenly going to fall into a distant second place by a company who was trying the exact same tactics with their previous generation's handheld system and failed miserably competing. A most excellent deduction there, Moriarty. He then says it's unfair and a fallacy to compare the PS Vita to the 3DS, despite the fact he does that throughout the entire article. Then just 2 paragraphs later, Colin passes off 3DS games as Nintendo 64 ports and tired, worn series. Which is hugely ironic considering half the PSN store for the PS Vita was nothing but PS1 games. And as for tired, worn series, you just announced the launch title lineup to include Uncharted and Resistance, but best of all, Super Stardust Delta, a sequel to a bloody Commodore Amiga game. I mean, Jesus Colin, that's not even hindsight. I mean, did you do any research, or are you just happy with the Niagara Falls complete bollocks that comes out of your mouth? But, in all honesty, one could say this was merely a sellout bump piece, and Colin was astroturfing the fuck out of the Vita for Sony with this blatant shill. But just as with a certain other famous Moriarty, simple research, rational thinking, and hindsight were what pushed him over his proverbial Swiss waterfall. Okay, something a little bit different for this episode. A few weeks ago, I gave a shout out on Twitter for suggestions for this video, and so many good ones came back, I thought it'd be a waste not to include them. Well, that and I'm too bloody lazy to milk a second video out of this topic. One of the earliest suggestions in gaming came from Aaron Shutt, with ex-Imagine Software PR, cum nutbag, Bruce Everis, and his insistence that Imagine Software collapsed due to piracy. And not the well-proven fact they blew all their money on sports cars, motorbikes, and developing a 32X Lite device for the Spectrum, which games would cost 5 times the price of a normal title. But Everis is still adamant on this, despite the fact there's multiple magazine articles, a BBC documentary which captured every single event, and he himself in 1984 said otherwise. Mega Do Your Mum 485 pointing out GameSpot's Danny O'Dwyer's tweet in response to that rigmarole over Tracer from Overwatch sticking her bum out in a pose from back in March 2016, with the line, "Really, not having the anime arse is a fair trade for not being raped as much." Daniel, unashamed of being a total remorseless scumbag there. Speaking of Daniels, Dan Ibbotson, aka DJ Slope, aka the bloke who sometimes edits these videos, as well as the English Gagawa, suggested the March 2001 issue of Edge. Down, Tin, down! Down! Bad, Tin! Bad! Edge magazine, with their cover title, Dreamcast Finished, Sega Unstoppable, where they proclaim that Sega would be a dominant force now they can release games on any system. A noble thought, but Sega's great plan of, you know all those great IPs we own, that our fans love and are always asking for sequels to? Well, let's never make any more of them ever again and shovel out increasingly crap Sonic games forevermore instead. Scuppered any of those chances. John Kraft, the French critic, suggested quite a few gems. But the best one was a Polygon article written by Phil Owen, where he not only reviews his own book, trying to disguise the fact by talking about himself as a third person, but points out it's a pay what you want ebook. Well, pay what you want, as long as you want to pay more than $3 for it. Quite a few of you suggested Tweedledee and Tweedledum themselves, Movie Bob and Jim Sterling. For you guys, oh you're so funny. I said suggestions for journalists. But finally, it also appears that stupidity isn't just confined to us English-speaking fellows either. Alex Vergan suggested the November 2013 issue of Mexican magazine Book. Yeah, just go with it. Pointing out that Nintendo are pulling out of the video game market. How they came to that assumption is anyone's guess. So, with all these great suggestions, what could have possibly topped them all to be number one? Yeah, you could probably see this one was coming a mile off, as it's littered with so many hilariously hindsightful gems, your head might explode. But for those of you in the dark, let's all cast our minds back to October 2000, with the release of Alien Resurrection on the PlayStation 1. The movie itself was a bit of a disappointment, aside from having Brad Dourif and that giant spazzy alien in it. But as a video game, it was considered to be the sequel to the fantastic Alien trilogy, a game that criminally never gets mentioned in top 10 movie license lists. Anyhow, developed by Argonaut, best known for creating Star Fox on the SNES, Alien Resurrection went through a bit of a rough time in development. It was originally meant to be a third-person affair before being scrapped and remade from scratch, and ended up being released 3 years after the movie's theatrical release during the death throes at a PS1. So this overlooked gem completely went under the radar of most gamers, sadly. But that didn't stop GameStop's Stephen Garrett from trying to bury it even further with its rather laughable review. Now, aside from Garrett's constant excitement about the PS2 coming out throughout the review, he dedicates almost 50% of the article solely to complaining about the game's controls. Argonauts are always ones for trying new ideas in their games, and tired of having to use shoulder buttons to strafing console first-person shooters, they decided to adopt an all-new control style, using the twin thumbsticks instead. Unfortunately, Garrett hated these bizarre controls so much, he penalises the entire game for them, spouting, "The game's control setup is its most terrifying element. The left analog stick moves you forward, back, and strafes left and right, while the right analog stick turns you and can be used to look up and down." Does that sound familiar to you? Yeah, that's right. He bitched about the control method of every single console-based first-person shooter has adopted for the past 15 years. Argonaut innovated the most popular control method in console gaming, well, ever, and he rips the entire game apart for it. He never shuts up about it either, going on to suggest gamers use a PlayStation's mouse instead, with 99.9% of PlayStation owners who have never seen the device will find the game almost unplayably difficult to control and unreasonably hard to enjoy. He then even suggests the game should have adopted the control method Medal of Honor used, which used that awkward shoulder button strafing style. Ironic really, considering Medal of Honor has used the Argonaut control layout for every subsequent game release since. Now, if you thought hindsight couldn't laugh at Steven any harder, the absolute cherry on top of this terrible review is Garrett then rounds it up with a hilariously delicious, "Fans of console first-person shooters or the Alien film series will probably be better off waiting for Fox's recently announced Aliens Colonial Marines for the PlayStation 2. That's right kids, you only have to hang on for another 13 years, 2 console generations, and one huge amount of disappointment for one of the most despised movie tie-ins in history. Yeah, that's well worth it. But wait, if you want some sprinkles of that cherry, well that's coming up right now, my friend. Stephen's final line is, "While no concrete details have been announced for the game yet, this is one instance where the unknown is preferable to the devil you know." Yeah, How am I supposed to come up with a retort to that? Anything I could say would just be an injustice. Thanks, Steve. You've ruined Fact Hunt. I might as well end the episode right here. Goodbye.